Okay, good afternoon. So we're going to be talking about just very basic genetics. This is your freshman high school level non-majors college genetics. So we're going to do some Punnett squares. It'll be a good time. And I have some resources that I'm going to link to you. And these are in Google Drive. Feel free to download them, and if you're having trouble accessing them, just let me know and I'll send them to you a different way. Okay, so let's get started. Let's get it started. Okay, let's see. Give me just a sec while I push buttons. Okay, so just like it says, this lesson is a work in progress. I'm still learning, and I'm doing my very, very best to put the best information as I have it at the moment. So I've made every effort to make sure that this lesson is completely fact-based and completely respectful as much as I can. And so my purpose here is to help inform my fellow melanin deficient people and to give my Black and brown students whatever tools that they need to help you defend yourself against racism as best as I can. I don't have much, but I've got this. All right, so let's move along. The first thing that you need to know is that there is no gene for race. That is the founding principle here. There's no gene for race. I'm a taxonomist, so I'm really good at defining categories. That is my biological training. I'm super good at it. I'm a published scientist. I literally got my master's degree by organizing things into categories. But race, as we think of it today, is not a biological category that is useful to anyone. It's not something that can be clearly or easily defined in a biological sense. Now, I want you to know that it is a thing, race is a thing socially, but not biologically. So we need to know those both of those things as being true. Okay, so if we're going to say that there's no gene for race, we need to first know what a gene is. Okay, so here we have a pair of homologous chromosomes. So one of these was inherited from your mom and one was inherited from your dad. And in this illustration, they've sectioned out each of these into bands of color. And these bands of color are sections of DNA. So these chromosomes are DNA that are wrapped around proteins, just twisted up really tight. So each of these sections, each of these bands of color, as shown in this illustration here, is a gene. That's what we think of as a gene. And so each of these genes has a gene buddy, a little gene friend on the homologous chromosome. So if you get a gene for freckles from your dad, there will be a freckle or no freckle gene that you get from your mom. So let's say, all right, here's freckles and here's freckles. Okay, is that making sense so far?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so each of these gene buddies is called an allele. So here's an allele, here's an allele, here's an allele. They code for the same thing. So if you have freckles on one of these chromosomes, you'll have a freckle gene on the other chromosome. Those are called alleles. Alleles are just our gene buddies. They are gene friends. All right, so genes code for a specific protein. So each section of DNA, its job is to help cells make a particular protein. So this is going to make the protein that causes freckles, for example, or this is going to code for the texture of your nose hairs. So they have very, very specific jobs that they do. Now that we know what a gene is, we can say with confidence that there is no single protein that is diagnostic of any human social group. So we have lots of features, right? We have nose shape and eye color and hair texture and skin tone, but there is not one single protein that can define a group that we would call race right now. Pushy button. Okay, so humans are a spectrum. We run the gamut of colors and textures and sizes and shapes. And most genes that code for appearance, things that we think of as indicative of race, are what are called non-Mendelian traits. So things like height, skin color, hair texture, nose shape. These are all things that there's not one or the other, right? So you don't have two choices, for example, when it comes to height or skin color or hair texture. Okay, if we understand that these things are not Mendelian traits, we got to figure out what a Mendelian trait is, first of all. So we're going to talk about an old white guy for a second. And this old white guy is Gregor Mendel. When he was a young man, he wanted to do science. He was the biggest nerd on his block, I'm pretty sure. His family sent him to school, but he ran out of money for school. And in order to keep doing science, he had to become a monk. He was not a people person. He did not enjoy doing kind of the public face of being a monk or being in a religious order. He was more of a people person. In fact, he enjoyed the garden more than he did his fellow people. So yes, all he is saying is give peace a chance. The dumb mom jokes will continue. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to pause the recording and make sure that the link to this video is with the video description. So those of you who are watching later on, make sure that you look and find that link in the video description. But for those of you attending live, have to figure out which button to push. Pardon me. Thank you for your patience. Oh, come on, little computer. Hold it. I appreciate your patience while I fuss with this.
It's no problem.
And we're back. All right, so let's keep on keeping on. All right, so Gregor Mendel noticed some things about peas. They're distinguishable varieties. So if we look in the chart on the right-hand side, we can see there's a purple flower or a white flower, you know, one or the other, and axial flower or a terminal flower. So axial just means on the side, terminal means on the top. The seeds are either yellow or green. They're either round or wrinkled, and so on. So these particular traits are not a smooth blend of the parents. So you don't get kind of a light purple, or you don't get kind of wrinkled, but not really, or you don't get kind of a blend between the green and the yellow. He also noticed that these traits, these particular forms, can skip a generation, just like we saw in the video. So the green peas will be present in one generation, in the parental generation, not in the offspring, but you will see them again in the offspring of the offspring. So in the grandbabies. Eventually, he found that each organism is inheriting two alleles, and we talked about what alleles were. They're gene buddies, right? One from each parent. So you get one allele from mom, one allele from dad. Those two gene buddies so are going to have maybe the same version or a different version of a particular section of DNA that codes for proteins. Is this making sense so far?
Yes.
Awesome. And just like we saw, some of these alleles are dominant. So some are, some will show up, like the yellow color, and some are recessive, so they won't show up if the dominant allele is present. So during gamete production, so when we are making eggs and sperm, I don't know what Toast is crying about. Anyway, can you hear him?
Yeah, a little bit.
I don't know. It's a zoo. Anyway, so while we're making eggs and sperm, these alleles are going to separate. So you are going to, so when I am personally making eggs, I will have the allele that came from my mother go into one egg, and the allele that came from my father go into a different egg. So these are going to separate during gamete production. All right, so meiosis and mitosis may have been a long time ago for some of y'all. And during mitosis, cells are dividing and basically cloning themselves. So they're going to be pretty much the same as the parent cell. In meiosis, there's no telling what the resulting 4 cells at the end are going to contain. We don't know which alleles they're going to have. So essentially, it's a fertilization lottery. We have no idea what alleles are going to be in each cell, and we have no idea what they're going to combine with.
Okay.
So this random sorting process is called the law of segregation. I didn't name this. Laws of segregation are no good for people. This is just what it's called when these alleles separate and sort out randomly. So We're talking about segregation of chromosomes during meiosis, not about segregation of people. That's literally the worst. Let's not do that. Okay. So dominant and recessive alleles. So one is going to show up. One is maybe not necessarily going to show up when the dominant is present. So when both dominant and recessive are inherited, so say if we're looking at our pea plants and one parent has purple flowers and one parent has white flowers, and we know that for sure the purple flowered one is a purebred purple flower, and so their babies are going to have one allele for purple, one allele for white. When both are inherited, the dominant one is expressed, so all of those babies are going to have purple flowers. Homozygous, homo means same, zygous means that refers to the alleles. Homozygous dominant means that the offspring are going to have two dominant alleles, so two of those purple genes, or alleles rather. Homozygous recessive, again, homo means same, zygous refers to alleles. So homozygous recessive means you get two recessive alleles. So you get two white flowers breed together and they don't have anything but those recessive alleles to give to their offspring. And so all of those offspring are going to be homozygous recessive. And in fact, in Mendelian traits, I say most because you never know with biology, everything is, once you say all in biology, there's probably an exception. That's just how it is. It's squishy and weird. Most of these recessive phenotypes, so a phenotype is what it looks like, how the gene is expressed. Most of these recessive phenotypes are going to be homozygous recessive. You don't see heterozygous recessive. You do see just heterozygous. So hetero means different. Zygous refers to the alleles. You get one dominant and one recessive allele. So if you get a purple and a white allele, you're going to have purple flowers because that purple is dominant. Is that making sense so far?
Yes.
Hopefully I'm not babbling too badly. Okay.
Nope.
So a Mendelian trait has one gene. So one section of DNA, like we saw in that illustration before, one of those little bands. Two gene friends, two alleles on homologous chromosomes. Remember, you get one from mom, one from dad. They become friends and they code for a particular protein, one single protein. So in the case of these pea plants, they're going to code for the protein that makes the color in the flower. So it may not be the pigment itself, it may be a mechanism that creates the pigment, for example. So one gene, two alleles, one protein.
Okay.
Mendel, good?
Yep.
Okay. So Mendelian traits are going to have two versions. It's on or off, dominant, recessive, purple or white, yellow or green. Right?
Yes.
So tall or short. So if a Mendelian trait involves one gene and has two versions, is race a Mendelian trait?
No.
No. The picture we have here was on the cover of National Geographic, and these two girls are twins. They were born at the same time. They have the same parents. And as you can see, they have very different complexions. They have different eye color, different hair texture. Do humans have Mendelian traits? So we've talked about Mendelian traits primarily in pea plants. Does this occur in humans? Yes. Yes, it does. Okay, so we do have Mendelian traits, and here's some examples of Mendelian traits. So dominant traits, if you have cleft chin or dimples or free earlobes, freckles, no hitchhiker's thumb. So a hitchhiker's thumb is if you take your thumb and bend it as far back as you can. If it bends at almost a 90-degree angle backwards, then you have a hitchhiker's thumb. If it won't bend backwards, then you don't have a hitchhiker's thumb. I do. My thumb bends backwards in kind of a freakish, bizarre way. Widow's peak is dominant. I do have a widow's peak. I'm not going to mess my hair up to show you though. And tongue rolling. Now, about tongue rolling, you can learn how to roll your tongue. You can learn that if you don't naturally do it. But we're talking about just kind of the natural ability to do it if you haven't made the effort to learn how to roll your tongue. Some of you are probably rolling your tongue right now just to see if you could. And the opposite are the recessive traits. So cleft chin is dominant, no cleft chin is recessive. Dimples are dominant, no dimples are recessive, and so on. So humans do have Mendelian traits. We have quite a few, actually. So we have, once again, Mendelian traits have one gene. They code for one protein, and they have two versions. And we can see it pretty clearly in the pictures here. These women on the left, they have very similar complexions, very similar hair types. They could be from the same family, in fact. So this redheaded lady on the far left, there's redheaded ladies, excuse me. The one on top has freckles, the one on bottom has no freckles. The middle lady has a widow's peak, the middle bottom lady has no widow's peak. The lady on the top right has a free earlobe, and the lady on the bottom right has an attached earlobe. So these are very similar looking people with these different Mendelian traits. And you can check and see whether your earlobes are attached or not if you like. Okay, so we talked about some Mendelian traits, and we saw that humans do have Mendelian traits. But race is not a Mendelian trait. There is not a single protein, there's not a single gene that is coded for that determines what your race is. It's not a biological category. Okay, Punnett squares. I'm so excited for Punnett squares. I love Punnett squares. So, just a sec. I need to push buttons. Okay. All right. So my husband can roll his tongue. I can roll my tongue. My oldest daughter, Iris, can roll her tongue. My littlest, Phoebe, cannot. Mystery. Why can't she roll her tongue? So these are our phenotypes. This is how this gene is expressed. And once again, yes, you can learn how to roll your tongue, but neither John nor I ever expended that effort. We have better things to do, frankly. Okay, so that's our phenotype. That's how the gene is expressed. The genotype is a representation of the alleles you inherit. So just for formatting, we use capital letters to represent dominant alleles and lowercase to represent recessive alleles. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Okay, so here we have a Punnett square that might explain why Phoebe can't roll her tongue. So if you can roll your tongue, you're either going to have two big R's or a big R and little r. So I can roll my tongue. I've got at least one big R. John can roll his tongue. He's got at least one big R. Phoebe cannot roll her tongue. So we know what her genotype is. If she cannot roll her tongue, she's going to have 2 little r's. So we can kind of reverse engineer this to figure out what my genotype and what John's genotype is. So if I've got at least 1 big R, John's got at least 1 big R, and Phoebe has 2 little r's, we know for a fact that my genotype is going to be heterozygous and John's genotype is going to be heterozygous. Otherwise, there's no possible way that Phoebe is going to inherit 2 little r, 2 recessive alleles. So it's kind of like a super complicated game of Connect 4. You take this and you slide it down. You take this, you slide it down. In this case, we reverse engineered it and we moved it up instead. You take this and you slide it across. And you take this and you slide it across. So there's a 75% chance that our offspring are going to be able to roll their tongues. So Iris can. She's in that 75%. And there is a 25% that our offspring will not be able to. And so Phoebe is in that 25%. There we go. Pretty cool. Love Punnett squares so much. All right. You ready to try a Punnett square?
Sure.
Some of you have probably done Punnett squares before, but you know, it's a fun time.
It is.
All right. So I'm going to stop sharing right now. I have a whiteboard. Let's try that. Okay. So we have for example, let's do dimples. Dimples are dominant. Hold it. There we go. Okay, dimples. Whoop. All right, dimples are dominant, no dimples are recessive. So we're going to use a big D for having dimples, and we're going to use a little d for not having dimples. So far, so good?
Yep.
Cool, cool. All right. See if I can do this. We're going to draw a little Punnett square. Here we go. All right, so let's say we have one parent who has dimples, and we know for a fact, for some reason, that this parent is heterozygous. So that's going to be a big D and a little d.
Okay.
It's not very tidy, but you know, it's what we got. And I'll make these red. We know that the other parent does not have dimples, so we know for sure that their genotype is going to be little d, just like that. So far, so good?
Yep.
So here's one parent up top. Here's one parent on the side. All right. So what's going to be in this box here?
A big D and a little d.
A big D and a little d. So we're going to drop that one down. We're going to scoot that one across, and we get big D and a little d. Just like that. All right. So what's going to be here?
2 little d's.
2 little d's. So once again, we're going to take this D here. We're going to drop it down. We're going to take this D here, and we're going to scooch it across. So we get little d, little d. And here,
It'll also be a big D, little d.
big D, little d. There we are. Once again, we're going to drop this one down. We're going to scooch this one across. And here,
It'll be 2 little d's.
2 little d's. Easy peasy, right?
Yes.
It's a fun time. Okay. Got that?
Yep.
We just drop these down and we scooch these across. And just as a formatting thing, we always put the dominant allele first because it looks nicer. That's really the only reason.
Makes sense.
Just like we capitalize a proper noun. Same kind of thing. All right. Now I want you to try some on your own. All right. So try some on your own. If you have to pause the video, no worries. Try some homozygous dominant with some homozygous recessive. Try 2 heterozygous traits together. Try 2 homozygous recessive traits together. Try 2 homozygous dominant traits together. Anything that you want to do. So if you're going to do one with freckles, you could have a big F representing having freckles, little f representing no freckles, or a big H and a little h for hitchhiker's thumb. You can use whatever letter that you want to. There's no rule about that. You can have a Q if you like. And I'm going to assume that you've done that. Do you want to have a minute to do a couple of Punnett squares? Maybe you can show me.
Good plan.
Okay. I'm going to assume that you've done some Punnett squares using these as your traits. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. And I'll see if I can help you out. Okay, so some Mendelian traits are diseases. So we're going to delve into race and healthcare just a little bit. We have dominant traits like Huntington's disease and achondroplasia. So these are respectively a degeneration of nerves in the brain and a form of dwarfism. So this particular form of dwarfism is a dominant trait. And then we have some recessive traits such as cystic fibrosis, sickle cell disease, and phenylketonuria. I always have to slow down when I say that one because I will trip over it for sure. So this is, a little less fun, and a little more serious than the traits we were talking about before, but they are still Mendelian traits. So let's talk about sickle cell disease. So in the United States, sickle cell disease affects about 100,000 Americans. And in the Black community, you're going to see sickle cell disease in 1 out of every 365 Black or African American births. You also see it in 1 out of every 16,000 and some Hispanic American births. And about 1 in 13. So if you know 13 Black Americans, Black or African Americans, at least one may have the sickle cell trait. So they're going to have this recessive trait to pass on. And once again, in a Mendelian gene, if you inherit a dominant and a recessive, then the dominant is going to be expressed and the recessive is not. So you will carry the gene for having sickle cell disease, but you will not have sickle cell disease. Okay. So this is a direct quote from the CDC. This particular disease, this particular recessive disease that we see so often in the Black community, affects people who have ancestors from sub-Saharan Africa, South America and the Caribbean, Saudi Arabia, India, and Mediterranean countries like Turkey, Greece, and Italy. And if you will notice, these are locations. These are locations. This has nothing to do with the race of the person who has sickle cell disease. This is the location of people who tend to have more occurrence of sickle cell disease. These are not human social groups. These are locations. It's not connected to skin color, it's not connected to language, and it's not connected to appearance. So for our Black and African American neighbors, genealogy is very difficult if you don't have European ancestors. There's a point in your genealogical history where it just stops. There is no more information. Now you can notice, you can see that there is a high incidence of sickle cell disease in Black and African American population, but you have no way of knowing what part of that person's ancestry is responsible for the trait of the sickle cell trait. There's no possible way. It could be an Italian or a Middle Eastern or a South American or a Caribbean relative. There's literally no way of knowing. So there are other health issues that are associated with minority groups, particularly Black Americans. And I will talk about Americans specifically because that's the data that I'm most familiar with. So we have high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, obesity, chronic pain, and maternal mortality. You see these most prevalent in the Black community and also very prevalent in Native communities as well, particularly high blood pressure, diabetes, and heart disease and obesity. I don't know the numbers on maternal mortality in the in Native populations, but I will see if I can look that up. So that is something I want to know. Okay, so minorities do have poor health outcomes, and this is not a problem that is new at all. W.B. Du Bois recognized this in the 1800s. So it's not that there's anything inherent in the Black community. It's just that the healthcare system is, as Mr. Du Bois states, is indifferent to the suffering of minority communities. That was true then.
There's also,
go ahead.
I was going to say, there's also all of those conditions in particular have a very strong link to the amount of mental and emotional stress the individual is under over a long-term period of time.
Exactly. That's exactly the point I'm getting to. Very well done.
Yeah.
So these are not genetic disparities. The tendency to develop diabetes and heart disease can have a genetic component to it, but broadly, especially in the Black and Native communities, these are the result of institutional racism. And just like Corin said, the daily stress of being subject to racism is going to affect your health. I'm going to pause the recording here. Okay, so once again, if you are watching this later, there's going to be a link in the description so that you can listen to that audio on your own. So I had the great opportunity to have a gentleman come and visit my class while I was giving this lecture. And he has a PhD. He's a very smart gentleman, a Black gentleman. And he told me that through his experience, this is a colleague of mine at work. And he told me that through his experience, he doesn't go to the doctor, partly because of this anticipation of discrimination. And that may be a contributing factor to health problems in his family. And this was a real concern for him. I definitely urge you, if you are one of my fellow Pale people, to consider how you're treated when you go to the doctor and how your neighbors might be treated differently. Okay, we're going to head back to the PowerPoint. Pushy buttons.
Let's turn now to a related topic.
Oh, stop that. Okay, so let's talk about skin color. Skin color is complicated. Skin color is not a Mendelian trait. It is not a Mendelian trait. And I don't know anyone to explain this better than the Amoeba sisters. Once again, I'm going to pause the recording and put a link to this video in the description. Jiminy crickets. Buttons. Okay, so non-Mendelian traits. As you can see, skin color and height and even eye color, there's at least 6, probably more genes that code for eye color. It's not a straightforward thing like these other Mendelian traits that we've looked at. You don't have either one or the other. You've got lots of genes that are contributing to the expression to the phenotype. Okay. So humans have a lot of genes. A lot of genes. I mean, I've only got 4 pair, but in my DNA, I've got over 21,000. And all humans share 90, yes, you can laugh about that. All humans share 99.9% of our genetic code. So the difference between me and literally everyone else who is a human is 0.1% of my genetic code. 0.1%, that's not a lot. There's a concept, it's called the 5 races. These are big, scary quotes. African, Asian, European, Native American, and Oceanian. It is outdated, it is false, and has nothing to do with any phenotype or genotype that I, as a taxonomist, could even try to categorize. So we do have some genetic variation that coincides with geography, just very roughly. But since humans were a thing in history, people have moved around. Even in the Vikings moved around. There is, if I'm correct about this, I may not be, but there is evidence of Vikings arriving in the Americas before anybody in the more southern parts of Europe had decided to take any boats over that way. And even when you consider very isolated human populations, they're not different enough to categorize as a taxonomic group. So I'm going to kind of bring you behind the scenes in the science of taxonomy. It's really difficult to explain what a species is or what a subspecies is. Largely, it depends on whether we can determine that one group is different enough from another group. And in the case of humans, there are no distinct groups that are different enough to categorize as a taxonomic group. We use, as taxonomists, we use what's called a syndrome of traits. And that has nothing to do with disease. That just means like a set of phenotypes or genotypes that we use to distinguish 2 groups. And if we take DNA from literally all over the world, none of those groups of people, those geographic groups of people, are going to be different enough to categorize as separate groups. So we're mostly very, very, very much the same. Most of the proteins that our DNA code for are going to be the same no matter where you're from. So if we think about maybe something like 23andMe, there was a study done, which I believe I've linked in the resources, but I'm not 100% sure. But there was a study done of 4,000 human alleles. And remember, there are over 21,000 genes. And this is just a sampling. Only about 300 of alleles, so not genes, but alleles, so forms of a gene, were found to be specific to a region. So that's roughly 300 alleles, not 300 genes, but 300 forms of genes. And this 7.4% of alleles that are specific to a region are only found in 1% of the population. So out of every 100 people, maybe one of them is going to have an allele that's specific to a region. And so the real takeaway there is that 23andMe can't tell you who you are. There may be a few alleles that might be specific to a particular region, but it's extremely difficult to narrow that down. And that's really just the sum of it. 23andMe cannot tell you who you are. That is a minuscule amount of genetic information. Okay, so why are we different? If it's not genetics, what's the difference between groups that we think of as ethnic or racial groups? The first is segregation. Throughout American and global history, people have been robbed of wealth, property, education, safety, and opportunity. And that carries on through generations. Because my grandparents were able to easily obtain home loans, buy property, become employed, in many cases have a military career. That helped out my parents, and my parents were able to help me out. So if you did not have those opportunities, if you did not have that wealth, if your grandparents didn't have those opportunities, that wealth, that education, then that's going to essentially trickle down through the generations. The other part, so we look to the past through the segregation in the past. The other part is what's ongoing now. Discrimination happens every day. We've been talking about policing and criminal justice lately, but that's not the only place where discrimination takes place. Even now, even though it is the law that persons or organizations that lend money for housing, even though that's the law, Black families are shown fewer houses than white families. They are shown poor quality houses than white families. Like we talked about before, there's discrimination in the doctor's office. There's discrimination in education. A teacher, for example, may call on white students more often than Black students, or Black students may experience more correction or more discipline than white students. And this is entirely disproportional to actual, however smart or well-behaved these students are. It's just that the teacher has an implicit bias and is not treating students equally. In technology, I've seen stories of soap dispensers. We've all had to wash our hands just like a crazy amount lately. And I really love those no-touch soap dispensers that you just put your hands under and the soap comes out and you don't have to touch anything. But if the sensor cannot recognize dark skin, then that makes it harder for you to wash your hands. That makes it easier for you to get a deadly disease during a pandemic. That sucks. And in democracy, one thing that's come up is where polling locations are. There are polling places available more in white neighborhoods than in Black neighborhoods. There's more opportunity to vote not to mention gerrymandering and other other ways that discrimination shows itself. For example, early voting helps out minority communities who may have limited access to transportation or other means to get to the polls, or who may be working on election day. Mail-in voting, for example, benefits minority communities. When voting is easier, then that benefits minority communities. So as you can see, we have not only what has happened in the past, but the ongoing discrimination, that continues today, that we've seen in the news, and that we don't see. Okay, so resources. There are so many resources on heredity and race, and there's another one from PBS that I just watched today that was really good. I will also include that in the description on this video. But I hope that this was useful. I hope that it was helpful, and I hope that it was informative. So before we go, Corin, do you have any questions?
Nope.
Nope. Good?
Nope, I'm good.
Cool. And thank you all for watching this lecture, and thank you for learning, and thank you for coming along with me on this journey. I will include the resources in the description of the video, and if I come across more resources after this is uploaded, I will also include those. There's lots of good stuff out there. All right, have a great day.